In this uproarious part of the poem Þrymskviða, we witness the gods of Norse mythology, particularly Thor, in a comical and relatable scenario. The story teaches us that the gods are not infallible beings but have very human characteristics, such as a sense of humour and the ability to find themselves in absurd situations. It showcases the Old Norse people's appreciation for wit, satire and light-heartedness. This light-hearted tale also highlights the cultural aspects of Norse society, including their fondness for festivities, celebrations, and the importance of maintaining one's honour. The concept of disguise and role-playing, as seen in Thor's transformation into a bride, reveals the Norse people's understanding of the power of deception and the lengths one would go to reclaim what is rightfully theirs. The poem's humorous nature and relatability emphasize the enduring qualities of Norse culture and asatru, the modern revival of Norse paganism. It demonstrates that the Old Norse had a keen sense of humour, comparable to our own, and that laughter and wit were integral to their way of life. This story invites us to appreciate the playful and human side of the gods and provides a glimpse into the rich tapestry of Norse culture that continues to resonate with people today. So sit back, relax, and prepare to be entertained by this mythological roller coaster ride that bridges the gap between ancient Norse culture and our modern sense of humour. Thor's drag wedding disaster. As the morning sun barely peeked over the horizon, Thor, the god of thunder, arose from his slumber. Immediately his heart sank like a stone in a fjord. Something was missing. His fingers grasped at the cold, empty space beside him. His hammer, Mjölnir, his trusted weapon, his faithful partner in giant smashing, was not there. With the subtlety of a thunderstorm, Thor's temper flared. His fury was a sight to behold. His eyebrows knitted into a thunderous scowl, his eyes sparked like lightning, and his beard shook wildly like a squirrel caught in a gale. His hair stood on end, so spiky you could probably skewer an apple on each strand. He turned over his bed, shook out his blankets, even peered inside his favourite mead jug, but the hammer was not there. It was like looking for a needle in a haystack, only the needle was a giant stone-crushing hammer, and the haystack was, well, the whole world. "Loki!" Thor bellowed with such volume that birds in the next county took panicked flight. "This is bad! No, worse than bad! It's... ah!" Words, usually not Thor's strong suit, utterly failed him. "My hammer's gone! Vanished! Kaput! It's an ex-hammer!" And so, still fuming, they found themselves at the doorstep of Freyja, the goddess known for her radiant beauty and her magical feather cloak. Thor, still blustering and puffing like an overheated teapot, made his plea. "Freyja, dear, sweet Freyja," Thor began, trying his best to look pitiful, which was quite a sight given his usual booming bravado. "I need a favour, a teensy-weensy one. Could I maybe, pretty please, borrow your feather cloak? I need to find my hammer. I'm really quite useless without it." Freyja, with a twinkle in her eye and barely suppressing a giggle at Thor's pitiful display, replied, "Thor, of course you can borrow it. Even if it was woven with silver and gold, it would be yours to use in your, noble quest." And so Loki, now adorned in Freyja's feather cloak, took off. The feathers rustled and hummed, creating a symphony of motion. Loki flapped away from the godly realm, heading straight towards the frosty reaches of the giant lands. Meanwhile, Thrym, the leader of the giants, was lounging around. You'd think he'd be busy causing mayhem, or at least tossing some mountains around. But no, he was in his backyard, fastening golden leashes onto his pets, which happened to be monstrous, fang-bearing dogs, and grooming his horses, their manes flowing and lustrous. You've heard of horse whisperers? Well, Thrym was a horse. Petter. Suddenly he spotted the unexpected arrival. "Hey Loki, what brings you here?" Thrym boomed, a mountain of a figure leaning forward in curiosity. "How are things back at the godly place, and the elf neighbourhood? What's new? And why are you all alone in giant country?" Loki wasted no time. "It's chaos back there," he lied, gesticulating wildly. "Doom, gloom and dread. The gods are upset. The elves are having a meltdown. Listen, Thrym, let's cut to the chase. You wouldn't happen to know anything about Thor's missing hammer, would you?" With a grin that was half smug and half knowing, Thrym confessed, "Oh, I've got Hlarithi's hammer all right. Buried it real deep, about 8 miles under. No one's lifting that any time soon." He leaned back, hands behind his head in a lazy, self-satisfied stretch. "And I'll only dig it up if I get something in return. Something like the lovely Freyja agreeing to be my wife." Well, that was unexpected, and also inconvenient. But Loki was nothing if not adaptable. With a sigh, he donned Freyja's feather cloak once more, the garment springing to life, rustling, flapping, and twirling in a kind of feathered frenzy. Then he was off, beating a hasty retreat from the land of the giants and heading back to the realm of the gods. Along the way, he had to dodge a very territorial group of migratory birds and a particularly obstinate cloud. Upon landing back in the courtyard of the gods, Loki found Thor waiting. And by waiting, we mean pacing back and forth like an agitated bear that had lost its favourite honeypot. The moment he saw Loki, his eyes lit up, a mix of desperate hope and mounting frustration. It was kind of like watching a child wait for the results of a particularly tricky math test, only with more beard and less patience. "All right, Loki, out with it!" Thor demanded, his booming voice reverberating off the courtyard walls. "What's the news? And no riddles, no jokes. We're not at one of your stand-up comedy nights, you know." He drew closer to Loki, his enormous figure looming like a particularly irritable thundercloud. "I want the whole story, Loki, and I want it now. You know what happens when you sit on a story too long. You start to forget things, or worse." Thor gave him a pointed look. "You lie down, get too comfortable, and start embellishing." It was clear that despite his impatience and frustration, Thor was also hopeful. He knew, as they all did, that if anyone could pull this off, it was Loki. If only because he really didn't want to face Thor's wrath if he didn't. "All right, Thor, brace yourself," Loki began, clearly taking a perverse pleasure in drawing out the suspense. "The good news is I found out who has your hammer. The bad news, well, it's Thrym, king of the giants, and he's not exactly in a sharing mood." Loki paused, probably for dramatic effect, before dropping the real bombshell. "In fact, Thrym won't part with your beloved hammer unless he gets Freyja as his blushing bride." So off they went to find Freyja, who was probably enjoying a nice, peaceful day before these two showed up. "Freyja, my dear," Loki began, with his characteristic charm, which at that moment was probably about as charming as a troll's armpit. "You may want to sit down for this. You see, we sort of need to hurry off to a wedding. Yours, actually." To say Freyja was livid would be akin to saying that Loki was a bit of a trickster or that Thor was mildly fond of his hammer. The goddess's reaction was something to behold. Her nostrils flared. She snorted with such intensity that it would put an enraged bull to shame. The great hall of the gods trembled as if caught in a tempest. Even her famed Brisingamen necklace, a prized relic and token of her power, burst under the onslaught of her fury. "Are you mad?" she seethed, her voice dripping with venom. "Marry Thrym, that oaf, that Neanderthal? I'd rather marry a sea serpent. I'd be the laughingstock of the 9 realms." With that emphatic rejection, the gods found themselves in a bit of a pickle, a conundrum, a veritable divine predicament. The tension in the air was so thick you could cut it with a knife. So they did what any self-respecting group of gods in crisis would do. They called a meeting. All the gods and goddesses convened, pouring into the grand hall from every corner of the celestial realm. This wasn't your usual afternoon tea chat. This was an emergency. Huddled together, they held council, their immortal brows furrowed in deep thought. The stakes were high. They had to come up with a plan, and fast. The question on everyone's mind, how in the 9 realms were they going to get Thor's hammer back without trading in one of their most cherished goddesses? The brainstorming session of the millennium had officially begun. Then Heimdall, the whitest of the gods and renowned for his wisdom, stepped forward with a solution. He had a knack for seeing the future, not unlike the Vanir, the other tribe of gods. "I've got it," he declared, a twinkle in his eye. "Let's dress Thor up as the bride. Yes, Thor, you heard me right. You'll don the bridal veil, you'll wear Freyja's busted Brising's necklace, and you'll look absolutely radiant." He went on to describe the ensemble in greater detail, clearly enjoying himself way too much. "Let's have keys jingling at your side. You know, a traditional symbol of a housewife. Your dress, oh, it'll be a lovely number. Reaching down to your knees will adorn your muscular chest with a nice, broad gemstone necklace. And to top it all off," Heimdall paused for dramatic effect, "a fetching little cap." Now, if Thor had been furious before, this idea turned him positively volcanic. "You want me to do what now?" he spluttered. "Dress up like a bride? The gods will never let me live it down. I'd be the punchline of every joke till Ragnarok." But then Loki, ever the voice of twisted reason, chimed in. "Hold on a second, Thor. Don't dismiss the idea just yet. Unless you fancy sharing Asgard with the giants, which will surely happen if you don't get your hammer back, maybe you should reconsider." And so, with a lot of grumbling and more than a few colourful curses, Thor reluctantly agreed. They fitted him with the bridal veil and Freyja's Brising's necklace, the once splendid artifact now serving as a choker for a very disgruntled, very large, and incredibly manly god in disguise. The sight was something none of the gods would forget any time soon. Not that they would ever let Thor forget it either. Next came the keys, jangling from Thor's broad belt, followed by a woman's dress that they somehow managed to stretch over his hulking frame. It barely reached his knees. Then an array of glistening gemstones was pressed onto his chest, just above the aforementioned ill-fitting dress. Finally, crowning this masterpiece was a pretty, delicate cap that perched precariously atop Thor's wild, fiery hair. Once Thor was fully decked out, Loki, who could barely contain his laughter, proclaimed, "I will accompany you, Thor, or should I say, the blushing bride, to the giant's home. As your maid of honor, of course." With that decided, they prepared for their journey. The goats that pulled Thor's chariot were brought forward. The animals seemed unnaturally eager, wrenching at their halters as though they too were in on the joke. The moment they started, the earth shook, mountains crumbled, and fire seemed to light up the sky. Quite an overreaction, but then again, who were we to judge how goats expressed their excitement? Meanwhile, in Jotunheim, Thrym, the leader of the giants, was bustling about with an energy that one could only describe as bridal jitters. "Come on, move it!" he roared at the other giants. "Put some straw on those benches. We've got a wedding to prepare for. Freya herself is coming to be my bride." His excitement was palpable. "I've got gold-horned cattle in my stables and jet-black oxen, a real treat for a wedding feast. My treasure trove is overflowing with gems and jewels, but none of that mattered because I lacked one gem, the most precious of all, Freya." While Thrym's preparations were underway, Loki and Thor, disguised as Freya and her maid, respectively, made their way to the giant's home. The journey was filled with a nervous Thor constantly adjusting his dress, and Loki unsuccessfully trying to muffle his laughter. All in all, a fitting start to the most unconventional rescue mission in the history of the Nine Realms. As the day rolled into evening, the giants brought out their mighty barrels of beer, enough to fill a lake. Thor, disguised as the blushing bride, sat alone at the table, his appetite rivaling that of a ravenous pack of wolves. He devoured an entire ox, chomping on it with such gusto that even the giants looked on in awe. Not content with just that, he proceeded to gobble up 8 plump salmon and all the delicacies laid out for the womenfolk. If there was a trophy for bridal binge eating, Thor would have won it hands down, and as if his hunger knew no bounds, he washed it all down with not 1, not 2, but 3 massive tons of mead, much to the astonishment of Sif's partner, who could only watch in mead-filled envy. Thrym, the dim-witted leader of the giants, scratched his head in perplexity. "I say, have you ever seen a bride with such an appetite? I haven't. This lady can outmunch even the most ravenous of trolls. And mead, oh, she can knock back mead like it's going out of style." Seated nearby, the quick-thinking Loki maid, doing her utmost to keep the charade intact, chimed in with a mischievous grin. "You see, dear Thrym," she whispered in a hushed tone, "Freya has been fasting for 8 long nights, her desire for Jotunheim driving her to hunger like you wouldn't believe. She couldn't wait to sink her teeth into your delectable feast." Thrym, fueled by a mixture of love-struck admiration and confusion, couldn't resist stealing a kiss from his supposed bride. Leaning in with lips puckered, he met with something that was definitely not what he expected. With a horrified yelp, he jumped back as if he'd just touched a hot iron. "What sorcery is this?" he exclaimed, rubbing his lips vigorously. "Freya, why do your kisses feel like the fiery embers of Muspelheim?" Once again, the quick-witted maid jumped in, her reply dripping with sarcastic sweetness. "Oh, Thrym, my dear giant with the brain of a pebble," she retorted. "Freya hasn't had a wink of sleep for 8 nights, her heart yearning for Jotunheim, the land of giants. It's no wonder her kisses burn with the intensity of 1,000 suns." The giant, not quite grasping the absurdity of the situation, nodded in understanding, too mesmerized by his bride's apparent nocturnal passion to question further. And so the feast continued, Thor barely able to contain his laughter as he scarfed down more food and navigated the treacherous waters of an outlandish wedding celebration. And just when you thought the chaos couldn't get any crazier, in stomped the giant's ill-fated sister, ready to claim her prize. Ignoring all sense of propriety and personal space, she boldly demanded, "Hand over those rings of red gold, or else you can kiss my love and approval goodbye." She wiggled her eyebrows suggestively, making everyone in the room feel rather uncomfortable. Thrym, eager to please his sister and secure her affections, shouted with a fervour that shook the very walls. "Quick! Bring in the hammer! Let it grace the maiden's knees! Only then will the mighty Mjölnir bless our union and the sacred bond of Vor." Now Thor, holding back his laughter with all his godly might, caught a glimpse of his cherished hammer, and his heart leaped with joy. But before he could contain himself, a mischievous grin spread across his face. In one swift, powerful movement, he lunged forward, not at the hammer but at Thrym himself, delivering a blow so epic that the giant king flew through the air like a clumsy seagull caught in a tornado. And that was just the beginning. With his laughter echoing through the hall, Thor unleashed his fury upon the stunned giant horde. One by one, they fell like overgrown dominoes, toppling under the might of Thor's uncontrollable glee. The chaos was so absurd that even the gods couldn't help but burst into fits of laughter, doubling over and slapping their thighs in amusement. But amidst the uproar, one person, or rather one giant sister, found herself in the wrong place at the wrong time. Thor's hammer, finding no better use for her demands, delivered a blow that sent her soaring through the air, landing in a heap with a bewildered expression and a muffled groan. It turns out Thor's hammer was quite efficient at replacing the currency of rings with an unexpected and rather painful alternative, and so, with a mixture of laughter and triumph, Othin's son reclaimed his beloved Mjölnir, the hammer that had caused so much chaos, hilarity, and questionable pain. The gods cheered, tears streaming down their faces from the sheer absurdity of it all. Thor, no longer burdened by his bride disguise, stood tall and proud, his hammer held high, while the remnants of the giant horde lay scattered like a giant-sized jigsaw puzzle, missing a few essential pieces. In the end, victory was theirs, and the halls of Asgard rang with the boisterous celebration of a prank gone brilliantly, if somewhat questionably, right. Thor's hammer was back where it belonged, and there was laughter to be heard throughout the realms from gods and mortals alike.